Talking about capitalism. Capitalism is an economic and social system in which the means of production are privately owned and operated for profit. Under capitalism, the prices of goods and services are determined by the competition in the free market. The philosophy of capitalism was birthed during the era of mercantilism, where European merchants set sail all over the world for goods and resources to bring back to sell on the market. During this period, merchants and the already established ruling elite class of colonial empires became enormously wealthy by exploiting natural resources around the world. At this point in history came the discovery of the New World and the expansion of colonial empires over subsistence cultures. Millions of people around the world became enslaved, victims of genocide, diseases spread, entire civilizations were destroyed. It wasn't great. Karl Marx wrote that with the rise of capitalist mode of production, for the first time, nature becomes purely an object for humankind, purely a matter of utility. It ceases to be recognized as a power for itself, and the theoretical discovery of its autonomous laws appear merely as a ruse so as to subjugate it under human needs, whether as an object of consumption or as a means of production. The rise of capitalism marks the point where humans separated themselves from nature and nature became an object or a collection of commodities to be exploited for profit. It is at this point where human beings began accumulating wealth for the sake of accumulating wealth, rather than the necessity of meeting their own needs. And with that wealth came the idea of private property and the privatization of the commons. Ruling elites began privatizing enormous swaths of land, forcing commoners who subsided off of that land into urban areas to work in factories. The urbanization of capitalism incentivized labor, which is the transformation of nature to satisfy human needs. The process of urbanization and privatization created the division between the proletariat working class and the bourgeoisie ruling class. Karl Marx noted that capital creates the bourgeoisie society and the universal appropriation of nature, as well as of the social bond itself by the members of society. Capitalism was founded on the promise of upward mobility in the free market, where if you work hard enough, you just might be emancipated from serfdom. This promise convinced the proletariat to accept their bondage on the 1 in a million shot they might become wealthy. And so many people believed this lie that there were armies of unemployed factory workers ready to fill the shoes of any worker that dare participate in the working class struggle against their employers. Further, the primary goal of those few who did manage to emancipate themselves from the slavery of their capitalist employers that robbed them of their own means of production was to own their own factories or plantations and then dominate or exert control over the proletariat workforce they just freed themselves from. Essentially, the promise of upward mobility under capitalism, oppression breeds oppression. This is because human nature at its core is rooted in greed, opportunism, and exploitation. Further, capitalism does not provide basic necessities, a living wage, health or well-being, and destroys the planet in the process. So at some point, we should ask ourselves, like, what's the point? While the history of mercantilism or factory labor capitalism seems rather brutal, it is far less complicated than the neoclassical era of corporate capitalism we operate under today. That is because contemporary capitalism is a fiction story we tell ourselves that exists within the empty shell of democracy we still seem to think or believe exists in the United States. It doesn't. The US is an oligarchy hiding behind this thin veneer of democracy. The power of free markets has been consolidated into the hands of corporate monopolization through government lobbying that stifles innovation. Yet we still like to tell ourselves that the free market exists. And the power of lobbying prevents any possibility of degrowth or a steady state economy because the elite oligarchs and corporatists make billions off of the extractive economy. So why would they let anything like that happen? They're going to lobby against it. The disparity of wealth between rich and poor has never been greater in the history of humanity. And the power of political corruption allows the downstream consequences and externalities of the extractive economy to fall into the laps of poor people or poor communities and undeveloped nations without consequence to the corporate elites who create these problems in the first place. Yet most people in the United States still describe themselves as capitalists, even though they have no capital. So you see, there is this paradox here where conservatives believe democracy and capitalism still exist, and they cling to this very tightly, although it's a false reality. And they've been tricked into believing that they are part of this culture war where poor people and liberals are to blame for all of their problems, when in reality, it is a class war where elites, politicians, and billionaires are to blame for everyone's problems. While the real solution is to come up with a new hyper-local system of capitalism, or the other is to form an anti-capitalist revolution and overthrow the government, the most effective solutions are often the most difficult. It's not easy to overthrow the government. So in the meantime, natural capitalism is the best thing we have. So I'll explain natural capitalism as proposed by Paul Hawken, Amory Lovins, and Hunter Lovins. And this provides a solution to the symptoms of capitalism without actually addressing the root cause of the issue, which is capitalism itself. And I think it's important to note that the environmental crisis cannot be solved under a capitalist framework. While natural capitalism is appealing, and it represents a corporate approach to sustainability that leaves the dominant structures of power and exploitation intact and promotes the ESG version of sustainability that has made sustainability so successful at the expense of its soul. So natural capitalism seeks to align sustainability with materiality and profit. They operate under the controversial but correct assumption that businesses doing the right thing by the environment can be profitable, which it can. This topic is so controversial because up until recently, businesses could ignore damage to the ecosystem because it didn't affect production or increase costs. However, anthropogenic climate change has increased the severity and frequency of natural disasters, disrupting supply chains. Further, the over-extraction of natural resource base that subsidizes the entire economy is shrinking at an unsustainable rate, which further threatens supply chains and could bring global production lines to a halt. Yet, most companies do not acknowledge that the intact ecosystems that underpin their business's success are vital to every company's longevity. It's because nature subsidizes the economy. The ecosystem services provided by nature subsidize the entire economy. Say that twice, it's important. All goods and services in the economy are a product of ecosystem services, and without nature, there would be no economy. There are four categories of ecosystem services, which include provisioning, supporting, regulating, and cultural ecosystem services. Provisioning services include food, water, timber, fuel, raw materials, etc. Regulating services include climate regulation, flood control, pollination, water purification, things that nature just does and self-regulates. Cultural services include recreation, tourism, spiritual enrichment, education. Supporting services include nutrient cycling, soil formation, photosynthesis, water cycling. Nature as a whole system provides these ecosystem services, and without intact ecosystems, the economy would collapse. Whole systems thinking and design is necessary to transition from extractive capitalism into natural capitalism. Natural capitalism postulates that there are four steps businesses must take to make doing the right thing profitable. So first, they must dramatically raise resource producibility. Two, close the loops. Three, shift to a solutions-based business model. Four, reinvest in restoring, sustaining, and expanding their own natural habitat and resource base. If a company can integrate whole systems design into their business model using these four steps, then they will achieve the strongest systems leverage point, which is proper design in the first place. So proper design in the first place, designs from nature rather than working against it. For example, Janine Benyus has this concept of biomimicry, which outlines things like, spiders that convert crickets and flies into silk as strong as Kevlar without boiling sulfuric acid. Abalone converts seawater into shells twice as strong as ceramics with no furnace. Trees turn sunlight into soil, or turn sunlight, water, and soil into wood with twice the bending strength as concrete, aluminum alloy, or steel. There's millions of examples of this over the course of 4.5 billion years of research and development and evolution. Nature has accomplished perfect design models that human beings should use as templates for how we design things in our economy. However, redesigning systems requires upfront costs. where costs will incur until the payback date. And redesigning systems will begin to generate a profit after the payback date, money that you put down into your high efficiency heating system. Upfront cost, eventually it'll start to pay back. Solar panels on your house, costs up front, eventually it will start to pay back. In general, companies buy items based on their initial cost rather than the full life cycle cost. So the cheaper, less efficient items that boost short-term quality capital returns are preferred, but cost more in the long term because they are less efficient and need to be replaced. So think doing business like this drives planned obsolescence, this wastes resources, and it wastes money. Waste is generated in every facet of a supply chain. A closed loop manufacturing model plus more efficient production processes could cut waste by 90% in most sectors. Every output of manufacturing should be composted or cycled back into the circular economy. This could remove pollution, toxicity, and waste from the system by replacing toxic products for safe alternatives that can safely return into nature. For example, finding safe alternatives to hazardous chemicals used in production saves money because disposal of hazardous waste to EPA and OSHA standards is expensive. So this proves that aligning your business with sustainability can be profitable. Waste is almost always thought of as a downstream problem, and waste generated upstream is rarely considered, which places the burden on the consumer rather than the producer. However, if zero waste was considered as an upstream problem, then there would be less strain on ecosystem provisioning of raw materials, which would maximize profits and keep ecosystems intact. Further, small changes in downstream consumption create huge savings upstream. For example, it takes 3 pounds of harvested wood to create 1 pound of lumber. Then, saving 1 pound of lumber downstream saves 3 pounds of trees upstream. Not to mention all of the environmental damage associated with harvesting trees in the first place. So only about 1% of materials extracted to create a single product go into the actual product being made. And these products only get used for an average of 6 months before being discarded at the end of life and end up in the landfill. In every sector, there are opportunities to reduce the amount of resources that go into production of products, which represents avoidable costs and profits to be won. Ray Anderson defines waste as any measurable input that does not produce customer value. The old paradigm of businesses that companies are these machines designed to generate as much value as possible. This is an outdated model. So like when firms and households and rational actors act in their own best self-interest, that is what's best for the economy, or so we've been told. However, the philosophy of Adam Smith has proven to be false. The old paradigm of the more products sold, the better has proven to waste money and resources. The new paradigm of selling products as a service is part of the solutions-based economy that outcompetes old models of business because it aligns with both parties' interests by improving customer value and provides bottom lines by doing better with less. If businesses want to survive into the future, providing a flow of services to a growing population of human beings, they're going to have to figure out how to do more with less. This is necessary because the living systems that subsidize the economy must be maintained or increased. Without investments in living systems and natural capital, shortages of ecosystem services are likely to become the limiting factor for the prosperity of the next century. For example, the fishing industry isn't constrained by the production of boats, but by the number of fish. Lumber isn't constrained by the number of available chainsaws, but by the number of trees. Agriculture isn't constrained by the number of plows, but by the amount of fertile topsoil. And these biological constraining factors cannot be substituted, and no amount of money can substitute for a stable climate or a productive biosphere. Further, companies and corporations are beginning to see that public perception affects sales. Companies are realizing that a strong environmental rating is a good predictor of profitability. Customers are more likely to do business with companies that make commitments to corporate social responsibility. I know I want to spend my money with companies that are responsible, if I had any. So there are a number of reasons why many companies still operate under the false assumption that sustainability and profits do not align. But natural capitalism addresses these problems by reintegrating ecological with economic goals. Because it's both necessary and profitable, it will subsume traditional industrialism with a new economy and a new paradigm of production, just as industrialism previously subsumed agrarianism. The companies that first make these changes in early adoptions will have described what, they'll have a competitive edge. And those that don't make this effort won't be a problem because ultimately they won't be around. So, like, there's a flip side of the coin to natural capitalism. Peter Huber wrote the book Hard Green, Saving the Environment from the Environmentalists, a conservative manifesto. It's insane. He wrote this book in response to the book Natural Capitalism, Creating the Next Industrial Revolution by Paul Hawkins, Amory Lovins, and Hunter Lovins, which I just described. And much like natural capitalism, Hard Green proposes that economic prosperity and environmental quality are complementary to one another. However, the hard green assumes that through the use of non-renewable resources such as coal, oil, and gas, within a few decades, the human race will perfect its mastery over nature and technology will save us from the environmental crisis. This is a typical example of the technology trap where we seem to believe that technology will save us from the problems technology created in the first place. So like the hard green categorizes coal, oil, and gas and other non-renewable energy sources as hard green resources, whatever that means, and discredits renewable resources such as wind, solar, hydroelectric, and geothermal as soft green. Huber proposes that the cure to the environmental crisis is creating more wealth, which can only be achieved through, according to him, neoliberal policy, dispersed regulatory control, free markets, and traditional conservative ethics. Uh, this comes under the assumption that people become wealthier, and as they become wealthier and more educated, their politics tend to lean more towards environmental conservation and green agendas. So on the other side of the coin, we have natural capitalism, which is a biocentric approach to capitalism that proposes the solutions to the environmental crisis is degrowth economy, where qualitative development is not aggregate with quantitative growth. And on the other side of the coin, we have hard green, which is this anthropocentric approach to capitalism that proposes the solution to the environmental crisis is neoliberalism and conservatism, which is insane. Hard green is like an oligarchical approach to sustainability that seeks to privatize climate change to generate wealth. And natural capitalism is a corporate approach to sustainability that seeks to commercialize climate change to generate wealth, which is also kind of insane. So under the current oligarchical presidential administration we have now masquerading as conservatism, hard green is the dominant social and economic paradigm. And under the former corporatist presidential administration we just had masquerading as liberalism, natural capitalism was the dominant social paradigm. In both cases, natural capitalism and hard green operate under the naive assumption that democracy still exists and free market capitalism and the invisible hand of the economy still regulate the economy, which is false. And under these capitalist frameworks, solving the environmental crisis is impossible. The only solution is an anti-capitalist Marxist revolution that seeks to overthrow the government that we believe shifts back and forth from liberal to conservative, but is actually shifting back and forth between corporatist and oligarchical. So like it's no wonder that government propaganda works so hard to convince conservatives to vilify Marxist doctrine, even without the most basic understanding of Marxist philosophy or the history of capitalism in the context of the imaginary capitalism we operate under today, because understanding Marxist philosophy exposes the lies we have been taught to keep us complacent in our own slavery. And if you think about it, like what did slaves work for all day? I mean, they worked for a place to live and food without any extra compensation to enjoy a basic quality of life, where all of the profits that they generate end up in the hands of their masters, and there's no chance for upward mobility. Now ask yourself how much of your paycheck goes to food and housing, how much of your labor goes to shareholder value, and how much of it actually ends up on your plate, how much of it goes to insane interest rates on your home if you own one, or how much of it goes to criminally high rent prices if you don't. This begs the question you should ask yourself, like, has capitalism been privatized to the point that it no longer exists? And the working class might just be slaves to the corporate oligarchy while being tricked into believing that they are free? As long as people believe that they are free but are not, The rat race will continue until there isn't a blade of grass left for cows to produce the cheese that rewards the rats.